If your company were broken into tonight, and the people who did it took something that mattered, would you tell anyone? Almost nobody does. That is the honest answer, and it is why this story is worth your evening. On the 12th of January, 2010, one of the largest companies on Earth did the opposite. Google published a post saying it had been attacked, that more than 20 other American companies had been attacked in the same operation, and that the attack came from China. Companies did not do that. Not then. A breach was something you disclosed to a regulator if the law made you, in the flattest language your lawyers could construct, months later, ideally on a Friday. In the next half hour, you get exactly how they got in. One browser flaw and one clicked link. What the attackers went looking for once inside, how long they stayed, and why the response was not a patch at all. Because what makes this the most consequential intrusion of its decade is not the malware. It is that a company read what had been taken, looked at what it had been agreeing to for 4 years, and shut down its own search engine in the biggest market on Earth. Let me set the scene properly, because the year is doing more work here than any technical detail will. In 2009, if you worked in security, your professional life was mostly spent on noise, worms, botnets, credit card theft at industrial scale, crime that wanted money at volume and genuinely did not care whose money it was or what you did for a living. The idea that a well-resourced group would spend months sitting quietly inside one specific company, hunting for one specific thing, was not new to anybody who had been briefed on it. But it lived in classified rooms and in vendor white papers that nobody outside the industry ever opened. There was not even settled language for it in public. The phrase advanced persistent threat existed, but it was jargon, and it was the kind of jargon that made executives assume they were being sold something. To most boards, a hack was a thing that defaced your website over a weekend. Google's post was titled "A New Approach to China." That title tells you immediately that it is not a security advisory. It reads like a decision that had already been taken, with the incident attached to explain it. It said the company had detected a highly sophisticated and targeted attack on its corporate infrastructure originating from China, and that the attack had resulted in the theft of intellectual property. It said that in the course of investigating that attack, Google had found that at least 20 other large companies had been targeted in the same way, across sectors including internet, finance, technology, media, and chemicals. And then it said a third thing, which is what turned a corporate security incident into an international political one. I am going to hold that back because it deserves an act of its own, and it is the hinge of the whole episode. Now, before we go anywhere near the malware, sit with the question of why a company discloses it all, because it is not obvious and the answer is contested. The cynical reading is that Google had already decided to change its position on China, that the commercial case for staying was weaker than it looked from outside, and that a dramatic intrusion gave the decision a shape the public would accept. You should hold that possibility open. It is not an unreasonable reading. The other reading is simpler and, I think, harder to dismiss. Once you know that 20 other companies are being hit by the same operation and you choose to say nothing at all, you have quietly made a decision on their behalf as well as your own. Whichever it was, and it can be both, the effect on everything that came afterwards was identical. There was now a named victim, a named origin, and a fixed public date. Every researcher who worked on it had somewhere to start. So how did they actually get in? This is the part everybody wants, and it is going to be less impressive than you expect. 2 days after the post, on the 14th of January, McAfee Labs said publicly that it had identified the entry point, a previously unknown vulnerability in Microsoft Internet Explorer, being exploited in the wild. Previously unknown is the entire thing. It has a name in this trade, a 0-day, 0, as in the number of days the vendor has had to build a fix, because until that moment, the vendor did not know the hole was there. The flaw was cataloged afterwards as CVE-2010-0249. What it permitted was remote code execution, which is the plainest and worst sentence in security. An attacker who can get you to load a page can run their own instructions on your computer. Sit with how ordinary the trigger is. not a firewall bypassed, not a server exposed to the open internet and forgotten about. A person at a desk on a Tuesday opening a link in the browser that their employer chose and installed for them. The delivery method was spear-phishing, not spam, spear. A message written for one named individual, referencing a project they were actually working on, appearing to come from a colleague or a contact they had every reason to trust. And this is the first thing I genuinely want you to take away tonight, because 16 years have passed and it has not moved an inch. The clever part of a serious intrusion is almost never the way in. The way in is a human being doing the exact thing their job requires them to do all day, which is to open messages and click on what is inside them. Everything that people find impressive, the exploit chain, the payload, the persistence, the months of quiet movement, the exfiltration, all of it happens after somebody did something entirely reasonable and was punished for it. Which means the useful security question was never, how do we stop people clicking? People will click. You will click. The question is, what is sitting on the other side of that click and how far it can reach once it is running? In 2009, inside a great many very large companies, the honest answer to how far can it reach was further than anyone had ever tested. Because the corporate network of that era was built in a shape that now sounds almost negligent. A hard outer wall, heavily defended, and then, inside it, trust. Get through that wall once, on any machine at all, and you were on the trusted side of the boundary, not with everything, but with far more than you should have had, and, this is the part that matters, with the ability to move sideways towards the rest. That shape is the whole reason a single browser flaw on one desktop becomes a months-long presence across an enterprise. Not because the flaw was extraordinary, because of the architecture that was waiting behind it. And every organization you have ever worked for has some version of that boundary. The question is only how much of it is left, and whether anybody has tested it since the last reorganization, the last acquisition, or the last time a team stood up a system in a hurry because a deadline was moving. There is a specific version of this that is worth naming because it is the one that survives every modernization program. Somewhere in the estate, there is a machine that other machines trust, that nobody currently owns, that was set up by somebody who has left, and that cannot be turned off because 3 things break when you try. Every organization has one. Most have several. They are not a failure of anybody's diligence. They are what happens when a company runs for 15 years and people move on. But they are exactly the shape of thing a patient operator is looking for, because trust that nobody maintains is trust that nobody is watching either. Now, what did the code actually do once it was running on that first machine? The payload researchers pulled apart was a backdoor. Symantec cataloged the family as Trojan.Hydrack. In a lot of the writing from the period, you will simply see it called the Aurora Trojan. A backdoor is exactly what it sounds like, and it is worth being precise about why it matters far more than the exploit that delivered it. Because the exploit gets all the headlines and does almost none of the damage. An exploit is a single event. It gets your code running once on one machine at one moment. If that is all you have, you lose everything the instant the user reboots, or the vendor ships a patch, or the machine is replaced. A backdoor converts that one moment into a standing arrangement. It arranges to survive a restart, it reaches outward to a server the operators control, and then it does the thing that makes it dangerous. It waits quietly for instructions. Outward is the word to hold on to. A firewall built to block connections coming in from the internet will cheerfully permit a connection going out to the internet, because going out is what an office computer does every second of the working day. So the traffic carrying the operator's commands looked, at the network level, like an ordinary machine talking to an ordinary website. There is nothing to alert on unless you already know what you are looking for, and in 2009, most organizations did not. And after that, it is patience rather than brilliance. Map what this machine can reach. Find where credentials are cached. Use them to step onto a second machine. Look again from there. Repeat, slowly, for as long as nobody notices. This is where the word persistent in advanced persistent threat is carrying the weight. Not sophisticated, persistent. The unit of time is months, not minutes, and the operators are being paid a salary to be patient. Google said the intrusions it saw ran through the second half of 2009 and were detected in December of that year. So on the most conservative reading, this was inside for a season before anybody saw it. The name of the operation, incidentally, is an accident, and I love it for what it says about the people involved. Researchers found the string Aurora inside a file path left in the malware binaries, apparently the name of a folder on the machine where the code had been compiled. Somebody built the thing in a directory they had named and shipped it without stripping the path out. Take a second with that. One of the most studied intrusions in the history of the field is known to us all by a folder name that somebody forgot to clean up before they pushed the build, which is a useful corrective, because the mental image people carry of the other end of an attack is a genius in a dark room. The reality is, people at work on a deadline making exactly the kind of mistake you made last Thursday. Here is the third thing in the post, which I set aside earlier, and which changes the category of the entire story. Google said that during investigation into its own network, it had discovered something separate, something that was not about Google's intellectual property at all. It said that the Gmail accounts of dozens of human rights activists connected with China were being routinely accessed by third parties. Read that wording again, because it was chosen with great care by people who knew it would be read closely. Routinely accessed, not broken into once, months ago. Accessed as an ongoing arrangement, as a matter of routine. Google also said, to its credit, that this access appeared in most cases not to have come from a hole in Gmail itself, but from things like phishing and malware placed directly on the user's own computers. That distinction is technically important, and its political effect was precisely zero. The claim standing in the room was that named individuals who were targets specifically because of what they campaigned about were having their mail read. And that is a different category of event from everything we have discussed so far. An intrusion that takes source code or design documents is theft. It is serious, it is expensive, and fundamentally, it is a matter between companies and their competitors to be settled with lawyers and better engineering. An intrusion that reads the mail of activists is surveillance of people. The stakes are not a quarter's earnings. The stakes are somebody's liberty, and in some circumstances, somebody's life. Now, context. Google had at that point been operating a censored search engine inside China for 4 years. It had accepted that trade openly, the argument being that a filtered service was better for Chinese users than no service at all, and it had taken sustained public criticism for making it. What the post did was connect those two things in a single move. It said, in effect, we accepted a compromise on the argument that we were doing more good than harm, and we have now learned new things about the system we are inside of. Whether you read that as principle or as a convenient exit, notice the mechanism, because the mechanism is the transferable part. The security incident produced facts. The facts reopened a business judgment that had been settled and defended for 4 years. That is a much rarer event than a 0 day. 0 days are found every week. Companies revisiting a settled strategic compromise because of what an incident response team put in front of them. That is close to unheard of. And I want to draw out why. Because there is something in it for anybody who has ever written an incident report that went nowhere. The reason findings usually change nothing is not that executives are stupid or indifferent. It is that a security finding normally arrives phrased as a risk, something that might happen to somebody at some point, expressed as a probability nobody can check. What landed on the desk in January 2010 was not a risk. It was a completed fact about the present. These specific accounts belonging to these specific people are being read now, routinely. A risk invites a discussion about appetite. A fact about the present forecloses that discussion, because the thing has already happened and the only remaining question is what you are going to do about it. If you ever need a finding to actually move something, that is the difference to aim for. Not a bigger number on a risk register, a sentence that is true in the present tense and that somebody senior cannot unknow. Let us talk about the other 20 companies, or 30, or 34, depending on whose count you read. And that range is not me hedging. It is the actual unresolved state of the record, and I would much rather tell you that than pick the number that sounds most authoritative and hope you do not check. Google's own post said more than 20 other large companies. Later reporting and vendor analysis put the number higher, into the 30s, and different lists do not contain the same names. So which is right? Genuinely unresolved. And the reason it is unresolved is the most useful thing in this act. Almost none of them said anything at all. A small handful confirmed publicly in extremely careful language, mostly after being named by somebody else first. Most never confirmed and never denied. Several were identified by researchers or journalists and declined to comment, which is not a confirmation and is not a denial and was never intended to be either. So the count depends entirely on what you're counting. Companies that admitted it, companies that analysts assessed had been hit, or companies that simply appeared in somebody's telemetry with the right indicators. Now, why the silence? Sit in that chair for a moment because the incentives are not stupid and pretending they are will not help you. Disclosure means your customers immediately ask what was taken, and in the first weeks, you very often do not know. It means your share price moves on incomplete information. It means regulators and class actions and a permanent search result with your name in it. Saying nothing, meanwhile, costs you nothing that appears on any statement you will ever have to publish. The cost is real, but it is diffuse, delayed, and lands mostly on other people. The trouble is what happens when everybody makes that individually rational choice at the same time. You get an industry that structurally cannot see the shape of what is being done to it. If 30 companies are hit by one coordinated operation and exactly one of them says so, the other 29 each experience it as their own private catastrophe. Nobody in any of those rooms can tell that it is a campaign, because campaign is a pattern and patterns need more than one data point. That is not a moral argument, it is an information argument. And it is the reasoning behind essentially every breach disclosure rule written since, from the SEC's reporting requirements to the incident reporting clauses in European law. And it is the second thing worth taking away tonight. The value of disclosing is mostly not to you. It is to the next company on the list. You are at some point going to be the next company on the list, and what you get then depends on what the last one did. Now we reach the hard part. And I am going to be considerably more careful here than most retellings of this story bothered to be. Who did it? Google said the attack originated from China. Security vendors and subsequent reporting attributed the operation to groups based in China, and some of that reporting asserted links between those groups and the Chinese state. Every verb in those two sentences is load-bearing. Google said, vendors attributed, reporting asserted. I chose all three deliberately, and I want you to notice why. Because here is what does not exist. 16 years later, a trial, a judgment, a finding of fact by any court in any jurisdiction. Nobody has been convicted of Operation Aurora. Nobody has been tried for it. That gap is not a technicality I am raising to be pedantic. It is what attribution actually is. And if you work anywhere near this field, you need to be able to hold the distinction without flinching. Attribution is an assessment. It is a symbol from things like the infrastructure the operators reused between campaigns, the hours of the day they were active, the language settings baked into their build tools, the specific targets they chose, and the code they shared with other operations. Any single one of those can be faked, and competent operators do fake them. All of them together, held consistently across a long campaign, are much harder to fake. Which is exactly why serious analysts weight the accumulated pattern rather than any individual artifact. But harder to fake is not the same as proven. And an assessment published by a company that sells security software, however good that company is not the same kind of object as a verdict. I want to be clear, because this is the point where people hear what they expect rather than what is said. I am not telling you the attribution is wrong. I have no basis whatsoever for saying that, and the consensus among the people who actually examined the evidence was strong and stayed strong. I am telling you that researchers assessed and a court found are two different claims with two different standards behind them, and that only the first has ever been made about this operation. Why should that matter to you, sitting there, 16 years downstream? Because this is the decade, in which attribution became an instrument of statecraft. Governments began standing at podiums and naming other governments for things that happened on computer networks as a routine diplomatic move. And the standard of evidence at a podium is not the standard of evidence in a courtroom. It cannot be. Most of the underlying material is classified, and publishing it destroys the method that collected it, which means you can only ever use it once. So the public is asked, permanently, to accept assessments. Very often, those assessments are correct. Occasionally, in other cases over the years, they have been wrong. And the correction has never traveled a fraction as far as the original accusation did. The habit worth building out of this is small and costs you nothing at all. When you read that a country did something on a network, notice who is making the claim, and notice whether they are describing evidence or describing a conclusion. That is the third takeaway, and it will still be useful long after every technical detail in this episode has been patched out of existence. Which brings us to what Google actually did about it, and what it did was not a patch. In the same post, the company said that these attacks, together with the surveillance they had uncovered, and combined with attempts over the preceding year to further limit free speech on the web in China, had brought it to a conclusion. It would stop censoring its results on Google.cn. Understand what that sentence meant commercially before you decide how you feel about it. Google was not the leader in Chinese search. It was a strong second, but China was the largest internet market on Earth, and it was growing faster than any other. And an uncensored search engine was not a thing anybody was permitted to operate there. So announcing we will stop censoring was, in practical terms, announcing we may shortly have to leave, and everyone in the room understood that. The company said it wanted to negotiate. It said it hoped to find some basis on which it could run an unfiltered service within the law. That was, on any honest reading, a very long shot. The negotiation did not produce one. And in March of 2010, Google acted on what it had said. It shut down search on Google.cn and redirected visitors to Google.com HK, its Hong Kong site, which served uncensored results and simplified Chinese from outside mainland jurisdiction. It was, as a political maneuver, a rather elegant piece of engineering. The same company, the same language, the same users, a different legal territory, and no filter applied by Google to anything. Beijing's response was that the redirect was unacceptable and that Google's internet content provider license, the permission a company needs to operate any website in the mainland at all, would not be renewed if the redirect continued. And losing that license would not merely have meant losing search. It would have meant losing the ability to run essentially any Google service inside the country, including the ones with nothing to do with search. So Google adjusted. It stopped the automatic redirect and replaced Google.cn with a landing page on which the visitor themselves clicked through to the Hong Kong site. Described literally, the difference is almost comic. The company stopped sending users to Hong Kong and instead put a door to Hong Kong directly in front of them and let them open it. And it worked. In July of 2010, the license was renewed. I want to be honest about how to read that ending because it is usually told either as a triumph or as a capitulation, and it is neither of those things. Google did not force a change in Chinese policy. Nothing about censorship in China became looser because of any of this, and it would be a fantasy to suggest otherwise. What the company did do was refuse to keep operating the filter with its own hands, accept a real and permanent commercial cost for that refusal, and then find the narrowest arrangement that let it remain present at all. Which is, I would argue, what institutional courage actually looks like when you see it up close. Not a clean stand with a clean ending. A real price, paid, followed by a negotiated position that nobody involved is entirely happy with. So, what actually changed across the industry and what is still changing because of it? The first thing is that the old trust models started to die. The hard shell network, heavily defended wall, soft trusting interior, was already understood by specialists to be indefensible, and Aurora was the demonstration that made ignoring them expensive. The direction of travel ever since has been to stop treating inside the network as meaning anything at all. Every request authenticated on its own merits, every device checked, no implicit trust granted to anything simply because of where a packet appears to have come from. You will hear it called zero trust. I should be careful with the causal claim here, because it gets badly overstated in vendor material. Google published its own work on this architecture some years later, and plenty of other pressures, cloud, mobile, remote work, pushed in the same direction. Aurora is part of that story, not the whole of it. The second thing is that targeted intrusion stopped being a specialist briefing topic and became a board topic permanently. Once a company with that much engineering talent said publicly that it had been inside out for months, "We are not really a target," stopped being a sentence anyone could say and survive. The third is the one nobody planned and nobody controls. Public attribution became normal. Before this, naming the country you believed responsible was extraordinary and slightly scandalous. Afterwards, it became a routine instrument of statecraft, and, as we have just spent an act establishing, one carrying a much lower evidentiary bar than the confidence of the language suggests. And then there is a fourth thing, which is smaller and more human and much less comfortable. The browser everyone was required to use, the internal network everyone was told to trust, the message that looked exactly like it came from a colleague. None of those have actually gone away. The tools are better now. The wall is thinner and considerably smarter, and the monitoring is real. But the way in is still a person at a desk opening something they were supposed to open on a day when they were busy. So what do you take out of all this tonight that is actually worth something to you? 4 things. 1. The way in is almost never the clever part. If you were deciding where to spend limited effort and limited budget, spend it on what is reachable after a click, not on trying to manufacture a workforce that never clicks anything. That workforce does not exist and never has existed. 2. Disclosure is mostly a gift to the next victim rather than to yourself. Every incentive you personally have points towards silence, and the sum of everybody being silent is an entire industry that cannot see a coordinated campaign while it is still running. 3. Learn to hear the difference between researchers assessed and a court found. This story has been told for 16 years, and the strongest thing anybody can honestly say about who did it remains an assessment. That is not a weakness in the reporting. It is the true state of public knowledge, and being able to sit with it without rounding it up is a genuine professional skill. 4. Watch what an organization does after it learns something, not what it says at the moment it learns it. Google's post was words, and words are free. Shutting down its own search product in the largest market on earth was the decision, and that one had a price attached that the company is still paying. And one last thing, because it is the thread running through every act tonight. Every part of this story that people remember is technical. The 0 day, the Trojan, the folder called Aurora, that somebody forgot to delete. Every part of it that actually mattered was a judgment call, made by people working with badly incomplete information, under time pressure, whether to say anything at all. Whether a compromise you accepted 4 years ago still holds now that you know this. Whether to keep a market or keep a position. None of those are security problems. They are the problems that security work hands to somebody else, usually at short notice. Next Saturday on Cyber Wars, we go back 3 years and to a very much smaller country, and the question changes shape completely. In 2007, Estonia. At that point, the most thoroughly digital state in Europe, a country that had deliberately moved its banking, its newspapers, and its government online, was pushed off the internet for weeks. Not one company. All of it, at once. And when Estonia turned to its allies and asked for help, it found that nobody could agree on what had even happened to it. Was it a crime? A protest? An attack on a member state? Nobody had a definition, which meant nobody had a response. If you got something out of this, follow the channel. That is genuinely the whole thing that keeps these being made. I will see you next Saturday.